Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. On this show, we're going to talk a little bit about New York State, the government that we have to live with, how they do things, and why they do things. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. My guest is State Senator Patrick Gallivan, and welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
My first question, this is the elephant in the room. There's 63 seats in the state Senate. Of that, 41 of them are held by Democrats. That's a supermajority, a very supermajority. As a Republican in the state Senate, and I'm sure representatives go through the same thing, how can you deal with such an overwhelming majority on the other side doing what they want? And as Democrats, they have a different philosophy. It changes from where the Republican usually basically like individualism and lower taxes and the ability for people to control their own destiny. Democrats increasingly now want government to be bigger and more controlling. How do you deal with that?
Well, you have to work a little differently. The main difference between the majority and the minority is, of course, it's, in simple terms, they have the votes, like duh, everybody knows that, but they set the agenda. So they actually set the agenda for the things that are voted on, whether you're voting yes or no. And when they set the agenda for things that they believe in and they want to advance, they have the built-in advantage of having the votes. So it's frustrating, it's very frustrating to not be involved in setting the agenda, but you have to work differently. You certainly can have an impact. But the way to have an impact, I believe, is you have to be willing to work with others, and you have to work it a little bit differently. You have to know the people on the other side of the aisle. You have to be able to work with the chairs of the various committees. You have to work with an executive from a different party. And in order to be successful in having some influence, certainly not the setting the agenda influence, I don't believe that you can do it by calling each other names and throwing hand grenades all the time. You have to try to do it in a constructive manner and trying to properly represent your constituents and advocate for the issues that are important to them. And we've had a measure of success in doing that on individual projects, individual pieces of legislation. We've even been able to influence some larger pieces of legislation, things I don't necessarily believe in, to make it less bad, so to speak. But that's our system. And if we want to change it in simple terms, we have to elect different people.
And that brings me to another area of question, and that is the way people vote in New York State. Outside of the downstate New York City area, New York is not a very liberal state. It's fairly down to earth, grassroots. The bigger cities tend to be more Democrat. But the huge weight at the end of the state is New York City. And the policies that benefit New York City don't necessarily, translate to what is good for, say, Erie County or this area. Outside of New York City, there is a certain amount of Democrats that, vote consistently and put the Democrats, keep them in power. It may not be something we can overcome, even with the rest of the state all, joining in, for Republicans. But why do people vote the way they vote? I very often look at the why of the situation. And when I was growing up in Buffalo, I grew up in a neighborhood where, my friends, their fathers were committeemen and they worked for the city, and everybody was a Democrat. And they were a Democrat because that's just the way it was. I mean, their families were Democrats, they grew up Democrat, and they voted Democrat. they never really talked about issues or reasoning. They talked about, that's just the way it is. And I'm not sure today that I understand where things are going. Again, the parties have changed. John F. Kennedy was a Democrat, but he wouldn't recognize his party today. It's vastly different. Where's it going, and why do people kind of support things like Mondami in New York City, who's a socialist?
Well, why people do what they do is a question that all of us would like to have the answer for, right? We could do well in business, we could do well in government, we could do well in many things. I do think that what we've looked at over in recent years is politics have become more divisive. And people are more inclined to identify others when we look at the world of government as you're a Democrat or you're a Republican. And that's how it seems how it translates to voters, where voters, so many voters just blindly vote for the party line. And I think that's where the problem is. You have to look at the individual. What is that individual going to do? What do they believe in? How are they going to properly represent you? What are they going to, are they ethical? Are they honest? Do they care about the community first versus the blue uniform or the red uniform? And we've seen examples of that. If we look in Erie County, we have seen a willingness for the voters in the county where it's more than 2-to-1 enrollment-wise Democrat over Republican will vote for a Republican if they believe that they're qualified. I was elected sheriff as a Republican. Nancy Naples is elected controller as a Republican. In modern times, we have John Garcia elected countywide as a Republican because the voters believed in them. And I think we need more of that. And now it's interesting, if you look at the data, and while I can't quote facts and figures, but you look at cities especially, and you look at certain pockets of cities, whether it's Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Albany, and then down to New York City, there's a tremendous Democratic enrollment advantage. And you see the votes translating that way, that people will just blindly vote Democrat. In some cases, Republicans don't even put candidates forward.
Is that because the Democrats have a stronger organization when it comes to reaching out to people and getting them, to vote in their direction? I guess what I'm asking is, in this state, is the Republican Party all that it should be in terms of, getting the vote out, appealing to people, and making a good case? I mean, it's obvious that the state is not doing well. That's fact number one. It's obvious that the state is controlled by Democrats. That's fact number two. You put those two facts together, and you would think that people would want to change. At least some people. But it doesn't seem to be.
Well, it's interesting. Some might point to the strength or the weakness of a particular party. I don't know that that's necessarily it. I think if a party is strong, they have a good ground game, they have a good network, whether it's town, village, citywide, or statewide, that can help. But it still comes down to the individual, whether they're going to vote or not, whether they're going to work to be an educated voter. Why do they continue to do the same thing? I don't know. Are you happy with the government you have right now? Most people will say no. Well, what are you doing to change it? We'll go back in time and it doesn't really matter whether you're for or against gun control, whether you care about the Second Amendment, which I do, or not. The example gets to the point that we're just talking about. After the SAFE Act was passed, Governor Cuomo was up for re-election. He wins a re-election by about 300,000 votes. Yet, you would go anywhere across upstate New York, even out on, well, not necessarily as much as on Long Island, and you see all those signs, the circle with the slash, no SAFE Act. Right. And I would talk with people at rallies against the SAFE Act, and I'd be standing around afterwards. You'd talk to 4, 5, 6 people, and I would say, okay, I'm assuming that you didn't vote for Cuomo. Well, no, I don't vote. No, I don't vote. 5 out of 7 people would say that. Yet they would come to a rally, they'd spend $10 for the lawn sign. There was over 1.5 million gun owners that didn't vote for the thing that they purport to care more about anything, they could have voted and determined the outcome of that governor's election. And so we look at the plight of cities. Some would say that, many say the Northeast cities especially have deteriorated over time. And they've had the same administration, the same party in charge year after year after year. And yet they still vote for the same thing. Why? I don't know. But I do think civic responsibility has to start at a very young age. It has to start in the home. People have to feel that their vote matters, and not everybody thinks that. But it does. The Bush-Gore election was decided by less than one vote per election district across the country. We've seen tie for supervisor a number of years ago in Marilla, a tie for supervisor in the town of Aurora a number of years ago. So votes do matter and your vote count, but we've got to do a better collective job of convincing people that. Who does that? The parties? Perhaps. Educators? Perhaps. Families? Perhaps. But I think therein lies the problem, is the educated citizenry and somehow doing better in trying to get the vote out or get people to vote. Now, as far as getting the vote out, you go to the political parties. They, of course, the responsibilities they take on, besides putting their platforms together, is helping to educate voters, right? Knocking on doors, getting information out on their particular candidate, and helping to educate people. You got to find good candidates. You got to find people that care and people that are willing to put citizens that they serve, supposed to serve first, and public policy first, versus the red team or the blue team. There's a lot there, but I think it comes down to the individual citizen and how they vote, and if they're willing to vote in an educated way for the right individual to represent them.
Well, we're just about out of time for this segment, and what you're saying is absolutely true. And mostly on the show, I try and stay away from Democrat versus Republican specifically. I try and talk more about common sense. Common sense is what should drive your vote. You know, if you there's an ad, and most ads are like this, but there's an ad recently about I think it's Zellner. He's running to be state senator again, and the ad that he has says nothing about New York State. Doesn't say anything about what he's going to do to improve things, how he's going to help people. The entire ad is about how he's anti-Trump, how he's going to fight Trump's agenda. It has nothing to do with what goes on in the state Senate. But that's what so many ads, especially on the left, that's what they hang their hat on. It's like, I'm not sure that the typical voter, and like you say, the well-educated voter, can look at an ad like that and care. But it must be effective, because that's so much of it is done that way. But anyway, we'll come back in a minute and talk more about this, and maybe get into a little bit more of what's going on in the Senate in New York State. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to The Big Picture. My guest is Patrick Gallivan, state senator, and we're talking about why people vote the way they do, what's happening in the state government, and it's dominated by a very supermajority on the left. I've spent my entire adult career in media, and when I started, a lot of the reporters came over from newspapers, and they were journalists. They would do a story on something, and they would say, this is what's going on. They wouldn't tell you this is bad that's going on, or this is good, or this is why it's going on. They just would say, this is what's happening. And then as a reader or as a viewer of the TV station, you would have to then say, okay, this is what's going on. Does that make sense or not? It was up to the viewer or the person who was getting the story to decide whether it made sense. that's not the media today. And that's part of what we've been talking about. The ads that are placed, the media, whether it's local TV or national TV or the cable networks, there's an agenda now. Back in the 1980s, things changed for news because the big networks decided that news had to be part of the profit center. It used to be that news was a service because you were obligated to the FCC to serve the community. So you weren't going to be making a profit from news. That changed in the 1980s. When you became a profit center, the news had to compete on a different level. They had to get people riled up so that they could get more people watching them and emotionally involved. That has evolved to the point where today, and we were just talking about this off camera, there are so many agendas in every story that you hear from whatever source. And I think that's part of what we're dealing with today.
I would say that there's still some journalists out there that try to properly practice, and I think they distinguish themselves. But clearly, I think it's harder for the reader of the few newspapers left, the viewer, the listener, the user of all the social media outlets that you see. I think it's harder for them to discern what the truth is. If we go back not too long ago, we look at most of the larger cities had two newspapers, a morning and an afternoon. One was a little bit over here, the other over here. And I think they kept each other a little bit more honest and a little bit more towards the middle. And so the viewer was able to, or the citizen, the recipient of the news, was able, it wasn't as hard to discern what the truth was. Now I think it's almost entirely incumbent, unfortunately, on the person that's on the receiving end. And I do think that that's problematic. You go, we'll look at national TV, cable. You've got the CNN and Fox, and people will say what they will, but you've got some people that all they will do is watch CNN or MSNBC, right. And then others will only watch Fox. Well, they're not getting it straight, right. Obviously. And then that person is going and voting a certain way. Not, in my view, if that's their main source of information, they're getting the slant and they don't necessarily know the whole story. And then you can, pick different media outlets, different things on social media and point to that. And then, of course, you've got AI is a whole new thing that's there now. So I think it's really hard for people to be educated and discern the truth. And that's something that our education system should be doing, is teaching people how to think, teaching people how to evaluate, teaching people how to ultimately come up with a conclusion that I guess they can be proud of, or that properly serves them and their families and their communities. And that becomes a real challenge. And so you commented a little bit earlier about negative campaigning. Why do people do it? And the consultants will tell you because it works. Yeah. And it may not necessarily convince you to come over to their side, but it offends people and it drives people away. And then you have the other side essentially has fewer voters. And people say, we go back to the not voting and I'm not going to bother. Well, you should bother because it matters. And those of us that are in public service should be talking that way, to say that your vote matters and you should be putting public policy first. That's what my office, that's what I've always tried to do in the various positions I held, whether it was as a trooper, as a sheriff of Erie County, or now in the state Senate. We try to do the right thing. We try to be honest. We try to respect others, other points of view, and not call people names, and focus on policy. So the policy in the state, we know our system is a majority and minority. And New York City is about half the population of the state, about half the representatives. They have a heavy influence in the policy coming out of Albany, and it doesn't necessarily have a positive effect on the rest of the state as much as they view it helping New York City, and that becomes a challenge. But if we focus on policy and why it's good for people or bad for people, I think we can better serve the public and have better outcomes in our communities instead of the problems that we see and the problems that continue to fester and not get solved.
You know, you've been in the business now, you've served for a long time. There's an impression out there that the division between the right and the left is widening and getting more pronounced. The Democrat Party, more and more, are embracing what they call democratic socialists. We have a mayor in New York City who is one. There's somebody who is about to be mayor in Washington, D.C., who's an avowed socialist. There's a mayor in Seattle who's a socialist. Years ago, they may have been left-leaning, but they didn't call themselves socialists. And that just, you know, goes to what's acceptable these days. And it's ever increasing. The divide seems to be getting greater. Is that an illusion, or is that actually happening?
I think there is a divide that has, if it's not gotten greater, it's become more visible and it's more pronounced, and we see more of it, especially on social media, between the right and the left. If we go back in time, we know we had McCarthyism, the scare of communists in the 50s and 60s, or the 50s rather. And we go back even further, and there was socialists in the 20s and 30s that called themselves that. So the Democratic Socialists of America are a defined party or group of people. They're not recognized as a party on the party line in New York State, so you can't vote on the ballot for them, but they're an organized group of people. And they have done a much better job of the mainstream Democrats and mainstream Republicans in organizing their people and getting them to vote. 100% of them vote, but 40% of the mainstream Democrats and Republicans vote. And that's why they've been successful in different places. So yeah, I think we have a significant division between the right and left. Perhaps it's widening, perhaps it's just more visible. But I still think that the overwhelming majority of people in the United States, in our communities, are that same bell curve. The bulk are in the middle, maybe slanting a little this way, slanting a little that way, but that's not what's happening in politics. You see with the various gerrymandering that's gone on over time, you see in Congress especially, most of the districts are far left or far right. We've seen a little bit more of that in New York State, in the Assembly and the Senate districts, and I think that becomes a problem.
They're still trying to.
Yeah, that was one of the negative things that just took place in our session. A redistricting amendment took place so that essentially, if it ultimately passes the two houses of the legislature and is approved by the citizens of the state next year, we would have redistricting at will, and it just isn't appropriate. It's wrong in New York. What's going on federally is wrong as well, and we shouldn't be doing something in New York just simply because you did it first and it was wrong, so now we're going to do it.
Is there anything that other than voting, is there anything that the average citizen can do to make a difference in this state? And you know, if they call your office and say, you know, you should look into this or you should look into that, or if they want to get involved in you know, helping out, there's such a feeling of helplessness, and I think you mentioned it. A lot of people don't vote because they don't think it's going to matter.
They get more and more discouraged and stay further and further away from it.
And that's, to an extent, that's built into society. You know, people, you know, they work hard, they come home, they take out the garbage, they take the dog for a walk, they do the laundry, you know, taking care of the kids, and they don't have time to get involved with something that's happening in Albany, even though it affects them directly. They're just too busy or too exhausted to pay attention to this. And that's probably part of the problem.
That's a problem, but that's the answer. I mean, civic engagement is not easy. It's not easy to be involved. It's not easy to stand up. It's not easy to work, to be educated, right? To take a time while you're raising kids, while you're working, while you're trying to pay the mortgage, while you're working the second job, whatever it might be. It's not easy to be looking at all the sources of information and trying to discern what is accurate or not. It's not easy to go to your representative's door, whether it's a legislator or somebody from the executive branch, and raise issues with them. It's not easy to call them and say, hey, I'm concerned about this, or send an email. But my belief is there's the answer. If the more people that we have involved in paying attention, the more people voting, the better for everybody.
Well, that's a good point to end on. We're about out of time now. Again, it's very important for you, your life, your quality of life, your family, to educate yourselves and pay attention to what's going on. It's not always the first thing on your agenda, but it's something that does affect you directly, constantly, because you're paying the bill. And you're putting the people into office by either voting or not voting. And that's, it's one way or the other, people have the ability to change things. It happens slowly, and it's not always, it doesn't always seem like it, but what you can do when it comes time to vote or get involved makes a difference. So anyway, I want to thank Patrick Gallivan for being my guest. I want to thank you for watching WBBZ-TV and for watching The Big Picture. We're your local TV station, and we appreciate it. So we'll see you next time on The Big Picture.